All right, today we're going to start Winter Danger by William O. Steele. I'm going to start out by reading about the author, and then we're going to dive into chapter 1. William O. Steele, 1917 to 1979, was born in Franklin, Tennessee. It was there, as a boy, exploring the fields and woods around his home, that he developed an interest in the history and pioneers of Tennessee. Later, as a grown man, he would write his historical adventure stories from his home on Signal Mountain, where he could look out at the same hills his characters saw during the days of the early frontier. William O. Steele published 39 books over his long career, many of them award winners, including The Perilous Road, which was named a Newbery Honor Book in 1959. And this book is dedicated for the G's, with many thanks. Chapter 1. "There's a hollow sycamore round the bend," Jared Amis yelled to his son. "We'll hole up there for the night." Micajah Amis nodded. There was no use trying to make his pa hear him over the drumming of the rain and the roar of the swollen creek beside them. Besides, there was nothing to say, though Cage reckoned a hollow sycamore was the last place in creation he wanted to sleep. He might as well be a coon or a possum, for he spent more time in hollow logs than in the open air, it seemed like. But an 11-year-old boy had to do what his pa said. Jared Amis was a woodsy. He lived by the woods. He had no trade. He couldn't farm a lick, or keep a store, or run a tavern. All he knew to do was follow the bear and deer through the woods and sleep in caves and hollow trees. The rain beat on Cage's face harder than ever and poured down his neck and chest. He took a firmer grip on the piece of deer hide he had wrapped around the middle of his rifle. He hoped that skin was keeping the wet out of his gunlock, though he didn't reckon anything could keep this rain out. His own deerskin shirt and breeches sure hadn't kept out any water. He was wet to the gizzard. He followed his father through the slashing rain, over the slick rocks and twisted tree roots, and along the muddy creek bank. There was the hollow sycamore ahead, a big tree, patched with shining white bark. Jared pointed through the twilight. He never forgot a good sleeping place. Much as he traveled through the woods and hills, they all stuck in his mind. No matter how far they journeyed, Cage knew that his pa would always have in mind a place for them to sleep. "Thar!" exclaimed Jared. "Just like it was 2 years ago when me and Josiah Skaggs were here." Cage didn't answer. He was wet and tired and cold to the marrow. His pa could stand in the rain all night and talk about Josiah Skaggs if he was a mind to. But Cage crawled quickly through the opening in the trunk and stood up inside. There was a space about 5 feet across inside the great hollow tree. It was dark and smelled of rotting wood and owls. Cage loosened the bundle he carried on his back. He laid his rifle down and then unrolled his bearskin pack. Quickly he slid out of his soaking buckskins. From his bundle he took a linsey shirt and slipped it on. It was too small for him, but it kept him warmer than the wet leather clothes he'd just taken off. The bearskin had been rolled so that the hair side was kept dry, and now Cage wrapped the fur around him and lay down. He could hear his father moving around. For a minute he hoped Jared was going to make a fire, but he should have known better. Pa never made a fire unless he had something to cook. Sometimes Cage thought his father wasn't human. He never seemed to need a fire to warm by, or just to sit by, peaceable and quiet while the flames leaped. Cage remembered how his ma had loved a fire. That was the way Jared was about everything, though. He'd been born in the woods. He lived there all his days, and would likely die there. He didn't mind the hard life. He liked being out there all by himself, with nobody to fuss him. "Here," said Jared through the dark. "Here's some corn. It ain't much. We'll have game tomorrow, sure." Cage fumbled for his father's hand and took the fistful of parched corn. In the darkness he chewed it slowly, trying to make it last as long as possible. It didn't go far toward filling his stomach. He'd not had a bite since morning, and only more parched corn then. If this stormy weather kept up, they'd likely not see any game tomorrow, and he'd die of hunger if he didn't eat soon. He knew he would. "You're all mighty quiet tonight," Jared said finally. "I ain't got nothing to say," answered Cage, and it was true, but he wondered at his father. Jared wasn't much of a one for talk either. Lots of times they went without speaking to each other from one day's end to the next. But something was the matter with Jared lately. He had something on his mind. He talked more, and he watched Cage a lot out of the corner of his eye with a wondering look. Sometimes he did things he'd never done before. Last week he'd spent 2 days hunting a bear because Cage had said he was tired of deer and wanted bear toes for supper. Always before, if Cage had complained about the food, Jared had growled about eating what you could get and not complaining. Now he laughed. "You and me is just alike. Don't neither of us talk much," he said, and yawned. "No, we ain't alike," Cage whispered fiercely to himself. "We ain't at all alike. If and I had my way, I wouldn't ever spend my days traipsing through the woods, cold and wet and hungry half the time. I'd sleep in a cabin, by a fire, with quilts and coverlids." Well, there wasn't any use thinking about it. He was Jared Amis's son, not some farmer's boy lying on a quilt in a tight loft with a good dinner of venison and ash cake under his buckskin shirt, and maybe greens or potatoes, and berries sweetened with honey or brown sugar. Sugar. Cage wondered what sugar would taste like. He moved his feet restlessly against the bear fur. He couldn't seem to get warm. The rain beat down outside with a sound like thunder. "If'n that rain stops afore morning," remarked Jared, "we'll have snow for sure." Cage lay still instantly. Snow. If they had snow, Jared would turn back north sure as shooting. He'd never taken Cage this far south before. They were in Indian country, for a fact, right this minute. Only yesterday Jared himself had said they'd stick to the mountain tops rather than walk in the valleys where the going was easier because they might meet Chickamaugas. And Cage reckoned the Chickamaugas were the meanest Injuns there were. Never in all his life had Cage known Jared to spend the winter far from a settlement. As soon as the frost lay thick on the ground and the trees were bare, Pa would lead Cage and his ma back toward the farms on the Yadkin or the Holston. Sometimes he built them a rough shelter, but more often they found some log house which had been abandoned. They'd run the squirrels and the wood rats out and settle in. Sometimes Jared would mend the roof and chink the logs, but other times he just let the rain pour in and the wind whistle through. Cage didn't mind. He and Ma were glad to have 4 walls around them and a roof over their heads, even if it leaked. And now surely, even if Ma was dead of the slow fever back in Kentucky somewhere, surely Jared didn't aim to tramp all winter. He'd turn back north soon as winter really came, Cage told himself, as he turned over and went to sleep. Cage woke the following morning as his father crawled through the opening. He sat up and saw that it was still raining outside. Mr. Amis stood up inside, shaking the water from his head and shoulders. "Well, it's a fine day out," he exclaimed. "Weather's so dry, fishes is gone to roost in the trees." Cage grinned. It was an old joke his father had made every rainy spell as far back as Cage could remember. Jared flung something down on the floor of the hollow tree. "That's the only critter I seen this morning, and I found him drownded in a canebrake." Cage held it up. It was the wettest, stringiest looking raccoon he'd ever seen. Jared glanced at him. "Skin it," he said briefly. "It ain't everybody gets a chance to eat drownded coon." Cage squatted near the entrance and began to clean and skin the animal. By the time he finished, his father had begun the fire. Jared's knife was stuck in the floor. He took a rifle flint from his shot bag and a piece of maple punk. He struck the steel blade of the knife a sharp blow with the flint. A spark fell on the punk held beside the knife and began to smolder. Jared blew gently on the rotted wood until a blaze appeared. Then he jerked dry splinters from the sycamore overhead and fed the fire. The little fire cheered Cage some as it leaped higher, and the hollow sycamore began to seem almost cheerful and homelike. He turned the coon on a piece of green cane over the fire, and the good smell of browning meat rose up with the wood smoke. The coon was not much of a meal, but Cage ate steadily, gnawing the bones and cracking them so he could suck out the sweet marrow. When the meat was gone, Cage put on his clothes. His buckskins were still wet, and even holding them up to the dying fire didn't take the chill from them. He flinched as he pulled the soggy breeches up over his legs. He made up his bundle of bearskin and linsey shirt and the wallet of gunpowder he carried. He slipped on his moccasins and picked up his rifle. Jared began to stamp out the fire. Cage watched with regret. He hated seeing the little flames die. He hated going out into the cold rain. At least in the sycamore tree it was dry. He stooped quickly and stepped out of the opening in the trunk. The rain drenched him in a second, his moccasins half filled with water from a puddle. He hunched his shoulders, trying to keep the rain from running down his neck, but his hair was dripping already and sent an icy stream down under his shirt over his shoulders. He stumbled after his father as they headed back toward the creek bank they had followed the day before. The ground was muddy and slippery, except where the big tree roots tangled and made walking harder still. They went along the creek for a spell, and then left it to climb higher up the mountain. After another hour's walking, they hit another creek, a bigger one, whose banks sloped steeply down toward the rushing water. Cage was tired. He felt as if he were carrying a piggin of water in each of his moccasins. He stopped to catch his breath and stood for a moment, staring down into the foaming water. The noise and the sight of the stream flying down the rocks made him dizzy. He looked up. Jared had disappeared among the trees. I'd best get on, Cage told himself. If he gets too far ahead, I'll not catch up with him afore night. He set out again, and then suddenly he began to run. He didn't know why, except he hated to be so far behind his father. It was lonesome here. Just being the two of them was bad enough, but Cage didn't want to be all alone. He pushed through the wet briar bushes and stumbled over rocks. His foot slipped, and before he could put out a hand to save himself, he went sliding and slithering down the creek bank. He grabbed out at the bushes, but they broke in his hands, and he hurtled down on toward the water. A sharp stone gashed his cheek. He clutched at a root, missed it, and brought up with a bump against a little sapling. His feet and legs dangled in the water, and he could feel the current tug at his moccasins. He drew his legs up on the bank and stood up, holding to the sapling. Slowly he made his way up the steep bank, pulling himself up by roots and branches. When he got to the top, he sat down wearily on a rock. He couldn't go on. He'd just have to sit here on the creek bank till Jared missed him and came back for him. He wiped the rain from his face with his hand and hunched his shoulders miserably. Maybe Jared wouldn't turn back. Maybe he'd just go on, not knowing or not caring about the boy he'd left behind, and Cage would sit here till he melted away from coldness and wetness and wretchedness. "Be ye daft?" asked a voice in his ear. "Did ye aim to sit here till dry weather?" "I fell down the creek bank," Cage answered hoarsely. "I can't go no further, Pa. I'm beat out." Jared stood looking down at him. "We'll rest a spell," he said finally. He looked around. "Come on, there's some rocks over there'll keep the wet off us some." Cage stood up. He started to follow his father, and then something made him burst out angrily. "Rest a spell! Keep the wet off us some! That ain't what I want! When'll we be going back north? Winter's coming, and this is Injun country. Did you aim to spend the winter here?" Jared turned. "Aye," he said calmly. "That's what I aimed to do."